All right, thank you so much for everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're tuning in around the world. But today we're going to be talking about how to leverage texting to increase supporter engagement. So really excited to provide just kind of a comprehensive overview of why texting might be beneficial to your organization, how to use it, and then specifically how you can go about using our texting features within NationBuilder to communicate with those folks. So excited to have everybody in the room today. Like to start out with just some quick introductions, so I can go first since I'm already talking. But my name is Kylie Malloy. I am a senior enterprise account manager with NationBuilder on our account management team, and I am zooming in from Seattle, Washington. So probably a little bit chillier than some of the other folks I've seen on the call that are in the South so far. So a little jealous of that, but I'm going to kick things over to Annette to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, I am zooming in from Detroit, so it is just the afternoon here, but excited to be here and talk through texting.
Awesome. Right, so today's agenda, we're going to be talking about why you should be using text messaging. So why is this a valuable tool for your organization? I know anybody that's probably been through the last election cycle here in the States or elsewhere can probably attest to the fact that they've seen an increasing number of texts come in on their phone, but just because everyone else is doing it, I don't find is a very compelling reason. So we'll do some grounding in that piece. We'll talk about how to send a text blast and walk through that step by step within your nation. We'll also talk about text keywords, which is, I think, a feature that's a little bit unique to NationBuilder. So we'll provide some education on that piece. And then we'll get into deliverability best practices. So some coaching on things that might go awry in trying to reach your supporters via text, ways you can solve for those pieces. And then we'll also think through some questions that might help inform your strategy about how you can layer texting into your other communication channels. And then, as I said, we'll open things up for questions at the end. So excited to be with you all today. So let's just start out by talking about why you should use texting in the first place. So as I mentioned, I really just kind of want to ground us in the data here because everyone else is doing it is not a super compelling reason. But it's really about those read and deliverability ratings. So 98% of texts are read and seen within the first 3 minutes, which is 5 times the average open rates for emails. So this is really a critical communication channel if you are making sure that you want to get something in front of your supporters, get them to read it as quickly as possible. It also has a much higher response rate. So it's a great opportunity for folks. I know we can all probably attest, especially during lockdown, that we've all been on our phone more than ever before. This is a great option for quickly gathering responses from folks, quickly pulling sentiment, asking people to take action on something. So it's really compelling for that reason as well. And then I know just depending on which states people are coming in from, where you're at in the world, there might be kind of varying degrees of reopening happening in your community. But I think the fact of the matter is there's going to be a substantial portion or meaningful portion of your community that's not yet ready to be in person, whether your organization is organizing those events just yet or not. And so I think texting is really another important medium to have in your kind of toolkit of different ways that you can be communicating with your supporters and sharing those updates. And then just to kind of talk a little bit about why texting is important in NationBuilder. Some of you might have done some texting in other platforms. You might have exported data from NationBuilder or another system and imported that into another texting tool. I think the value of really running your texting program within NationBuilder is because you're able to leverage that existing data that you have on the supporter. So what actions have they responded to in the past? What events have they attended? And you're really able to use that to inform the audience that you're collecting. And all of that's going to really help you make the right ask to the right person at the right time. So I think that's really the benefit of doing texting within NationBuilder as opposed to just bringing that spreadsheet into another texting platform. You might not really know who those supporters are. You might be working with a spreadsheet that's just first, last name, number, and opt-in status. And so I think doing that in NationBuilder allows you to be a lot more customized and personalized in those communications. All right, and then I do also want to talk about how different organizations might consider using texting. So I mentioned at the beginning that texting, I think, is something we've seen political campaigns and candidates run with over the last 2 years here, but I don't want to say that texting is something that should only be used by those groups. So if you are a nonprofit organization, you might think about using texting to communicate with volunteers. Maybe you have an urgent need for donations that's come up, something related to like the service that you're provided to your specific community. I think texting is a great mechanism for sharing those kinds of communications with folks. For advocacy alerts, it's a great way to share urgent calls to action. So do you have a bill that's up for vote? Are you trying to get folks to sign on in support or opposition of a specific petition? This is a great way to get something to folks quickly, doesn't get as lost in the inbox as an email message might. And it can be really timely and powerful when used correctly. And then of course, candidates and campaigns, whether you are looking to make fundraising asks, looking to have information campaigns where you're sharing information with voters about how they can show up on election day, where they need to go, what those registration deadlines are. I think it's really powerful for GOTV purposes, as well as for some of those other asks that you might be making of supporters or potential supporters that you're in conversation with. If you're a membership organization, you might think about using text messaging to pull members on a program that you're planning to launch, ask them to respond to a survey, share a reminder about some of those membership benefits that might be expiring by end of year that they haven't yet used. So I think it can be really helpful for that. And then development teams. I know oftentimes when I talk with customers, they are really hesitant in thinking about making fundraising asks via text, but it's something we're increasingly seeing different organizations and campaigns start to use. So I think it's something that we shouldn't overlook. And while that maybe shouldn't be the first text that a supporter ever receives from your organization, I think reaching out to donors via text can be a really powerful way to get them to think about other ways that they contribute, how much their dollars are contributing to your overall mission. And so I think it can be really helpful for a really broad swath of organizations. Okay, and so some folks in the room might be familiar with two different types of applications or channels rather for text messages. So wanted to just kind of walk through those two options. The first one is going to be A2P or application to peer texting. So this is effectively describing any communication, any text channel really in which an application or software, so NationBuilder in this case, is the mechanism actually sending those messages as opposed to a human person. So for application to peer texting, this is really a channel that's ideal for mass one-way communications that have a clear and singular call to action. This is the type of texting that is supported within NationBuilder. There is another kind of texting that you can use, and I would consider using both personally, but it's called peer-to-peer texting. And this is really more conversational. This is more of kind of that back and forth between two folks. I think this is really best for personalized conversations that might be managed by staff, volunteers, interns that your organization is working with. I think it can be really helpful for those persuasion conversations or maybe questions where it's not as easy for them to respond with a one-word answer. And that's something that we don't support directly within NationBuilder, but we do have a variety of integrated providers that support peer-to-peer texting. Those include Call Hub, Prompt, and Supporter Base. Okay, and I'm going to pass things over to Annette now to walk us through how you can go about sending a text blast within NationBuilder.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. So we're going to talk through a little bit about how to send a text, and then we're actually going to walk through it in the product. First reminder here is that the first thing that you'll want to do is confirm that text messages are included in your plan. So starter customers will need to add on a phone number. Pro and enterprise customers can add those for free. You can check out the NationBuilder pricing page for more information. And then enterprise customers, I think I see some of you here, you can reach directly out to your enterprise account manager with information on that. The second step is to attach a virtual phone number to your broadcaster. So reminder that texting is tied to broadcasters. Each broadcaster can have a phone number associated with it. And that's how that's where the texting settings live as well. And then finally, getting ready to send your first text blast. So getting ready might include choosing your audience, eventually crafting your message. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. So when you come in, add a phone number in your broadcaster settings, you'll have the option to determine and configure some settings. So each time a supporter uses a text to contact your nation, our system will by default try to collect profile details before sending an auto response that you might set up. And so one of the first things you want to do once you add your phone number will be to configure these settings. Existing supporters that you text won't be asked to provide this info, but you can choose whether or not you want to collect information on their name, their email, or their address. You can select the specificity of that address. And then in addition, if you want everyone who texts in for the first time to receive tags or be assigned to a point person, this texting settings section is where you would configure that. We would recommend that you configure these settings in a way that aligns with what your goals are for how you'll follow up. So for example, if you uncheck all of these, maybe you're just working to get all of that information out into the world. New people who send a text in to the broadcaster would not be receiving a name. You might not have the details that you need on them in order to take that follow-up. There might be a situation where that is fine. If you are planning to either figure out where they live or want to follow up via email, make sure that you check these boxes off so that the system will by default choose those. And then in terms of the point people or the tags, if you're specifically reaching out to receive something like feedback, then it might be helpful to have a person who's specifically tied. So that could be another use case for when you select that option, but these will be totally up to you and is something that you can set up as you're configuring it all. Next step will be to select your audience. So within NationBuilder, you can only send text messages to those who are textable. Similar to email, it's super important that you've got that opt-in. We're going to talk a little bit about the strategy later on, but folks who might be a good contender for receiving texts might be those who are receiving emails but might not be opening them, those who are playing a key role in a campaign or an initiative or even an event that you want to get some quick info to, or those who might have RSVP to an event. As Kylie mentioned, we're all getting lots of texts and I think that having that reminder right in your phone where you live all the time can be helpful as a reminder to jump on. And then just coming back to what textable actually means, that essentially means that you've got a phone number for them, they've opted in. We're going to talk a little bit about best practices for growing your textable list, but at the very basics of it, you've got a filter in your people section that you could check out right now, actually, to see if you have people in there who are currently textable. But that's a great way to understand who your audience will be at the highest level before you even go into further segments. Once you have defined your audience, it'll be best to craft your message. So I always say that oftentimes the technology is the easy part and like the planning and strategy takes a little bit more time. So I think as it relates to text, this falls under that umbrella. Make sure that your text message is targeted to your audience. So if you were choosing to reach out to event RSVPs, you would want to maybe have the content relate to that. You will be forced to keep it brief, so messages will be limited to 160 characters. Definitely recommend including a clear call to action that will give folks the opportunity to do what you're hoping that they do. Because it's short and sweet, you'll have to, it can be helpful to iterate on what you send. So maybe one week you send something and you find that you don't get a great response rate. You've got the ability to test that out, see what kind of language resonates with your audience and go from there. Similar to email, avoiding spammy language or links in that first text. So things like sale or claim your prize, all caps. Those will be things that are more likely to get you flagged. So keeping your messages as clear as possible. And then another note, if you're hoping to include special characters or emojis, that is included in that 160. So while I think they can be helpful, just noting that can often change how many words you can include. So just trying to find that balance. So I am going to really quickly hop into the product here. And thumbs up if you can see my Mary Smith broadcaster. Wonderful. So just a reminder that these are, they populate in the broadcaster. So that's where we've begun. In the communications tab, I've clicked into this new broadcaster. And the first thing that we have already done is set up a phone number. So I'm not going to walk through that, but essentially, if you didn't have a phone number added, you'd be prompted when you click texting to add one. Now that I've set one up already, we'll see that the details are there and it's prompting us to create a new text blast. You can do that by just clicking this blue button, or you can also click up under here right next to your phone number. We will go over a few more of these settings later, but for now, we'll just click into new text blast. The slug of your text blast, if you're familiar with sending email, similar to how that functions, this is meant to be a short and identifiable name for this blast. So I'm going to imagine that we have an event coming up. And so you might choose to use a naming convention here. That's totally up to you. You'll be able to see the date in your dashboard there. And then this is where you'll add your message. I have copied, something so that I can add, because typing in a webinar always leads to typos for me. So we're just imagining that we are sending out a note, imagining that they have already RSVP'd, but it's been a crazy week. We want to just send them a message, make sure that we actually have people at the training. So we can't wait to see you tonight for our event kickoff. This text stop to opt out is required. So just noting that as you're crafting your message, you'll want to make sure that that stays in there. And once you've got your message crafted, we'll go ahead and choose preview and choose recipients. Oh, I did test this out. So let's imagine that we're sending this tomorrow. It's just flagging for me that I already used this slug. Okay, so once you select your message, you'll be prompted to choose your recipients. So you can send to a list, to those who have a specific tag, those who populate in a filter, or to everyone. In this case, I have created a short filter of folks who are textable. And so once you select that on the right, you can click Save Recipients, and they will populate on the left. And then we'll click through to Preview, where you'll get a final chance to review everything. If you did want to send a text test, you could add the number here. You can choose to schedule your text blast on a certain date as well as a time. But for now, for today's webinar, we'll just click Send Now to 2 people. And so you'll get this message saying that it's on the docket to be sent. Once you send it, you'll see that we have certain data points on this specific text. You can review that specific text and your past text by just clicking back. I'm going to go through these breadcrumbs here because I think we'll see something new under texting and then blasts. So from this blast, you can see that 2 were sent, no responses yet. And you can also see who's unsubscribed or those that may have failed. And I think that is mostly it when it comes to sending a text blast. While I'm here, I might just show responses. So the next thing that we'll talk about is when if someone were to respond to this text, you would see that in your incoming tab. We haven't gotten any, so they're not there yet, but that's where that would live. So I'm going to jump back to the deck unless Kylie, anything else we might want to show here? I feel like that covers it.
No, I think that's good.
Great. That's not what I want to do. Sorry, guys. Sorry, everyone. So after your text blast, where do they show up? They show up on the profile of the person who texted back. So had someone sent a text in, we would see that both on their profile as well as under the broadcaster texting. And then we'll see the sent blasts under in the dashboard. Unlike email, we don't have the ability to track filter for opens or clicks, but Kylie's going to cover that a little bit later in the section on strategy. And so we will keep moving along. Keywords. Keywords are another huge benefit of using text messages in NationBuilder. Keywords allow your supporters to take action directly from their phones and are linked to our action pages. So on your website, you can set up keywords on an endorsement, event, petition, sign up, or a vote pledge page. This means that if you wanted folks to RSVP, rather than sitting down at their computer, going to your web page and RSVPing for the event, you can set up a keyword, and you do that in the event settings of that particular page, so that everyone who texts in that number, their record will reflect that they took action on the page where you've linked that keyword. So that means that if you have any settings that are set up for those that do RSVP, those will also be applied to those who text in. And you can also set up an automated response for those keywords. So if you're like me, you do best when you have like an example. So we have the option, this is totally optional, but if you want to be in the shoes of a text recipient, we've got this keyword set up so you can test it out on your own. So if you want to go ahead now and just text webinar to the number that you see on your screen, you will go through the experience of what it's like to be on the receiving end of a text from NationBuilder. You can see that Kylie is laid out here for us on the slide, what it looks like in that person's profile to receive those texts. And then the only other thing that I want to call out is that currently we've got these settings configured so that we are asking for your name, your email, your address. So if you notice that our system is asking you for those pieces of information, that's why. And that is something that you have the ability to configure should you not want to receive those. Once we've received that information, you'll find that you receive the auto response message.
And I think Taylor had a question in the chat just about incoming text messages. So I just want to call out Taylor as well. Like, this is what it would look like on the right-hand side on somebody's individual profile when they are responding to a text. So as Annette mentioned, I think on the other side, you can see the incoming responses in two places, both like on this person's record and in that incoming tab of the broadcaster. So if you want to get like a sense of like all the messages somebody has sent in, going to their individual record is probably a good place to start. But I imagine for most folks, they might just send one message. So viewing that under the broadcaster settings would probably be a good spot.
Thanks, Kylie. So maybe some of you are taking advantage of this test. I'm going to keep on moving. Just one more little bit. So a final piece related to keywords that we wanted to talk through is the idea of conversation trees. So using these text keywords, you can mimic a back and forth with your supporters. And the way that you do that is, you can walk your community through a list of questions using these keywords based off of giving them the option to chime in with those keywords. So you can see, will you pledge to vote for Lincoln? If so, choose pledge. You can think of opportunities where maybe they have questions about the event, where you want to lead them somewhere, or I think this is a place where there's a lot of creativity that you can go through, whether you want to send tailored responses, collect information from them as you might through a survey. All of these would simply be set up by choosing and setting up specific keywords on that same event page. So yeah, I think Kylie, I will send it back to you for deliverability.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's talk about when deliverability doesn't go so well. So I think as we're all probably used to in the email space, just because you've sent somebody an email does not mean that it lands in their inbox. There could be a variety of things that go wrong. Maybe you are sending to a work email address that they no longer have access to because they've changed jobs. Maybe their inbox is full, so they're not able to receive any additional messages. Or maybe the carrier bounced your email from that person's inbox, so they never even saw it, or it landed in the spam folder. We're starting to see a lot of those same practices show up in the texting space. So wanted to spend some time specifically walking through what some of those are, how you can troubleshoot and solve for those. But I would say that the main issues that I find folks running into when you're trying to run a texting program and texts aren't getting delivered, it's typically because you're either sending to an invalid number, there's some queuing happening in the product, which I'll talk about, or there's carrier filtering going on. So those are kind of the big three to keep in mind. All right, so when you are sending a text blast, texts usually send at a rate of 1 segment per second. And 1 segment usually means 1 text message. That said, there are exceptions to that. So if you are, for example, sending a message that includes special characters, so this might include if you're sending, for example, upside down exclamation points, if you're texting in Spanish, if you're using emojis, that will break your message into 2 different segments. So that's important to keep in mind. You'll have 70 characters to play with if you are using special characters in your message, but it can sometimes take longer to send if you're going beyond that 70 character limit and including those special characters. So I think this is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about time sensitive send. So if you're thinking about sending out a message that's a reminder for a webinar or a live event or a volunteership that you have coming up, it's really important to just take that into account and do some kind of quick math to make sure that you have enough time to get those messages out to your supporters, because obviously the last thing you want is people receiving a message that's reminding them about an event while that event is going on. So for time sensitive sends, I'd recommend, especially if you're using those standard 10-digit numbers that you can connect in NationBuilder, that you consider sending multiple blasts from multiple broadcasters. And our general recommendation rule of thumb there is, I would say typically from one of those numbers, it will take an hour to send 5,000 messages. So if it makes sense for your organization and you have a list of, let's say, 10,000 people that you're trying to send a webinar reminder to, would recommend breaking that into 2 blasts sent from 2 different broadcasters to 5,000 people each. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about invalid numbers. And so it's really important when you are sending text blasts and running your text program to making sure that you are only texting active and valid mobile numbers. So oftentimes I'll find folks, maybe you have inherited a list as your organization has been around for quite some time that includes data that's not always the most clean. So there might be, for example, home numbers in the mobile number field. And conversely, you might have mobile numbers that are in a home number field that you've never texted. But it's really important to just kind of regularly audit those numbers to remove anything that's misformatted. I know a lot of times if people are signing up online, if they're on their phone, they might hit like a special character or a letter or something in the number that's clearly not supposed to be there. So I'd recommend doing kind of a quick scan for that. Any obviously fake numbers. You know, people are kind of in a day and age where they're maybe a little bit more hesitant sometimes to share a phone number, depending on how they prefer to be contacted. So you might see some like 000 numbers, some 555 numbers. So I'd recommend just keeping that as part of your regular practice to make sure you're looking out for those and removing them from the list. And ideally, whenever possible, asking that supporter if they can provide an updated number. And definitely non-US numbers. So the product will prevent you from sending text messages to non-US numbers if you are in the States. So I would recommend just taking a look at that just to make sure that the area codes correspond with numbers that are in the particular country that you're texting from. And then of course, you want to keep it as part of your regular practice to ask supporters to confirm or update their mobile numbers. So although I think this happens a little bit less frequently than with email, you might have somebody that's provided a work phone number. They no longer work at that job and the number is no longer good for them. Maybe they change plans, change providers, all those different things could mean potentially changing the phone number. Again, it does happen less regularly than we see with email addresses, but would recommend just having that as part of your regular practice to make sure you have clean data. And Casablanca, I do think Puerto Rico is included in US numbers, but we can make sure to confirm that for you and follow up if that's not the case. Okay, carrier filtering. So I think this is by and large, oftentimes the thing that can be the most challenging, because in the same way as when a email service provider like Gmail, for example, bounces your email from getting to the inbox, you don't always get a specific information from them as to why they decided not to deliver that message into the person's inbox. Same with cell phone carriers. They don't always tell you exactly why they chose not to deliver your text message, but as a best practice, it's typically messages that they consider to be spammy. So I think with that in mind, it's really important to think about what you're including in the content of that message. So are there a lot of links? Are you using a link shortener? Is there spammy language in there? And I have a few examples there, but it's important to make sure that that does not show up in your messaging, just to as best as possible, try to avoid any carrier filtering. The other thing I'll say is that for folks in kind of the political space, we definitely did see kind of a slight increase in some of that carrier filtering around the election, just with concerns around election misinformation. So it's important to keep in mind kind of contextual trends there as well, just around like important deadlines or things that you might be messaging on. I think it's One thing you can think about when it comes to sending links, because a lot of times supporters or organizations that I'm working with are wanting to send their supporters a link. One option that you might consider is using a text keyword to send links to only people that request them. So you're not including a link in every outgoing message, but similar to the example Annette just walked through, maybe you send out a text blast that says, respond link if you want to receive the link to this call to action or this survey or whatever it is that you're asking your supporters to click through. And then that way, only the folks that are interested in taking the action will receive the link. So you're sending out less links, which means less likelihood of being filtered. And that's especially important, again, if you're texting from one of those 10-digit numbers and you're texting a larger audience. And last but not least, again, same as email, really need to make sure that you are honoring the opt-out, just to make sure that your texting program is legally compliant. So not sending texts to people that have not consented to receive them. So for example, some folks in the political space, maybe you have a data set that you've purchased, you're using that for door knocking. Maybe that data set includes phone numbers. If those people have not opted in to receive text messages from your campaign, your candidate, your organization, you should not be texting them point blank, and making sure that we're removing people who opt out from distribution lists. Part of that is supported within the product. So for example, if people respond with that opt-out language that you've included in your message, so they respond with stop, they will be automatically opted out from receiving messages. They'll no longer be textable in NationBuilder since they've opted out. So you'll no longer be able to include them on lists that you're sending text blasts to. That said, I'm sure we all see sometimes people are not so great at following directions. You might have somebody that responds with more colorful language about why they no longer want to receive text from your organization. So it's always important to keep that in mind as well, just to make sure that you can opt those people out as you see those responses come through. Okay, there may be a situation where you're keeping all of these best practices in mind. You're doing your best to audit your list, but you're still struggling with text deliverability. In that case, we have a few different service offerings that we can provide to assist with that and improve your text deliverability. One of those is a line type identification and validation service. Through this service, you can effectively take either a subset or all phone numbers in your nation. We can run that through a validation service that basically confirms which of those numbers are mobile versus landline numbers. So you stop paying to send text to numbers that will never be able to receive them. It also can be useful, again, for identifying some of those textable numbers that might have been stored in the wrong field. So for example, maybe somehow a mobile number got imported into that fax number field and you've never sent that person a text message, even though they've opted in. So there's some good value there just in terms of both cleaning your list and potentially identifying new people for you to text. The other options that I'll talk through are really good for filtering or just addressing any kind of queuing that's happening. So if you're struggling to get your messages out quickly, you're sending to large volumes, these are some good options for you to consider, as well as carrier filtering. Toll-free numbers, these are usually numbers that start with either 855 or 833. So do you just want to call out that difference because it's going to be different than the local area code that you're able to pick when you're just connecting a number within the NationBuilder control panel. But this can be a really helpful tool for dramatically reducing carrier filtering. It will also deliver your text 3 times faster because it's going to have a higher throughput rate. And so an ability to send those messages more quickly than a standard 10-digit number. The other option I'll talk about is short codes. So this is something that is really something I recommend for folks that are sending to really high volumes of supporters. So we're thinking tens, hundreds of thousands of people that you're sending text to in a given month. This is going to be basically the Cadillac version of numbers that you can be sending from. It is the most authenticated, most verified. You're going to go through an extensive application process with carriers. And this is really something that I think is worth investing in if you consider texting to be kind of a foundation of your engagement program with supporters. If it's something that you envision for doing for a long period of time, going with a short code is probably going to be a good investment for your organization to make. But those are those 5-6 digit numbers that you might receive text from. And they're also 100 times faster than those standard 10-digit numbers. So again, good for large volume texters. The other thing I just want to flag on this slide too that we're kind of watching for is something called 10DLC, which is essentially a new number type that carriers are rolling out that's going to be specifically for application to peer texting traffic. And so that's something that's going to hopefully have lower rates of carrier filtering. There might be some additional costs associated with it that carriers are imposing. So just stay tuned for some more information about that. But again, if you have questions about any of these pieces, definitely feel free to reach out to our team, reach out to our support team for folks that might not have a dedicated account manager, and we'd be happy to explore any of these different offerings with you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you can incorporate text messaging into your strategy. As we're thinking about it, I like to lead with some of the questions that you might consider in thinking about how texting fits in for your specific organization. So let's think about who I should reach out to via text and when. So I know some people in the room might be thinking right away, like there's this group of supporters or maybe this one individual supporter that I know does not want to receive text from our organization. Every organization's supporter base is going to be different. So there are going to be some people that prefer to receive text messages because they're on their phone more often. There will also be folks that find it really disruptive and don't like receiving text messages. So you obviously know your supporter base best, but I think it's important to think about who might be a good group to pilot that with. So generally I recommend people that are engaged supporters, people that have responded well to other communication methods that you might have used with them in the past. And I think when it comes to timing, when you're first getting started, it might make sense to think about what's an important date or deadline for our organization. So maybe is it the deadline to register to vote in our state? Maybe it is an annual day of awareness that our organization has coming up. Maybe it's a day in which an important issue that we care about is up for a vote in Congress. So thinking about when you should do that first outreach, I think is also important, just to kind of pilot how that response is. And I would say too that there are going to be different responses probably from different subsets. So maybe your donors respond really poorly to text messages, but your volunteers absolutely love it. That's going to be kind of an iterative process that I think your organization can go through as you're starting to think through where texting might fit into your existing strategy. I think the other kind of most asked questions that both Annette and myself get from customers that are talking about texting, especially when you're just getting started, is how do I get more opted-in numbers to text? And so I think one of the best ways to do that is just by changing your website settings. So if you have your NationBuilder or your website hosted on NationBuilder or not, make sure that you're asking people for a mobile number and asking them for consent to text them at that mobile number. That's a great way just to be collecting more of those numbers at your normal kind of acquisition point. So at your main sign up page that most supporters are coming in on, make sure that that's asking for that information. Within NationBuilder under site settings, you can default it so that mobile number is surfaced on all pages across that specific site. So that's another good option to consider for folks that do have a NationBuilder website. And I think the other thing that you might consider there is keywords. So if we're thinking about maybe a large event or a webinar or a town hall that our organization is hosting, using a keyword can be a great strategy there because you can just put that up on a slide and say, text join to this number that's associated with your broadcaster, and people will text in, and that way you'll have them opted in. And in your nation, if that phone number already exists in your nation, it'll just update with that person and just have them opted in so you're able to text them. So it's a great way, I'd say, typically for in-person events or other live engagements, but certainly you can put it on your website as well if you want people to text in directly from the website. Okay. Thinking about opening, this is a piece that I think is a little bit tricky. I think throughout today's presentation, I've made a number of parallels between texting and email, and this is, I think, one area where they really diverge. So currently, it's not possible to track who is opening a text message. That's not information that we receive. That said, we have those stats indicating what those open and read rates are like from industry analysis. But I would say if it's really important to you to be thinking about who's opening these messages, you really want to have a better sense of who actually takes action on the alerts that I send out via SMS. I think there are a few options to consider. One might be using, you can use tools to create special URLs that are only for text messaging. So for example, maybe I have 2 petition pages and I send out a link to one petition page via text and one via email. That's a great way just to kind of understand who are those people that are actually signing up on the petition and took that action via SMS. So that's one option. I think another thing to think about is setting up keywords for that, again, because you're able to apply those action settings. So if I'm asking folks to sign a petition, for example, maybe I send a text blast that says, text petition if you want to sign this petition. People that respond will have the action settings that you've configured for that page applied to their profile. So if you set up 4 people on that page, they have a petition tag that's added to their record to indicate that they signed the petition and took that action. That same thing will happen for people that took that action via text by texting in the keyword associated with that page. So it's another great way just to identify people that are taking that particular action. think something else that's important to think about, this again, coming back into some of those similarities with email, is thinking about A/B testing messages. So as I mentioned, I find a lot of organizations use text messaging as more kind of a playful and creative format with their supporters. It's typically a little bit less buttoned up than email simply because you have fewer characters to communicate your message. You may be using emojis that you would never consider using in an email. So I think it's a really great space to be playful and creative, but definitely A/B test. And as I said before, I think different audiences respond differently. So there might be different kind of tone that you want to take with newer supporters versus more tenured volunteers. And then lastly, let's talk about other communication channels. So certainly as part of this webinar, we're not advocating that texting should be your end all be all method for communicating with supporters. I think there are different circumstances and different types of communications that make sense to go out through different mediums. But I do think it's really important to think about how text messaging can be layered in with your other communication channels, in particular, how you might want to segment that out. So for example, if you are potentially somebody that's calling in from Virginia, you might be receiving texts, emails, phone calls, mailers all the time. And I imagine a lot of people are not as thrilled with that. So I think it's important to think about which kind of ways you're reaching out to your supporters. So if you're reaching out to somebody with a phone call or a mailer, does it also make sense to reach out to them via text? I think this is important to consider from a budgeting perspective as well. So if you are paying to send somebody a text message, do you also want to pay to send them a physical mailer, et cetera? So I think it's important to think about how text messaging can be layered in. I know for a lot of organizations, if you're working on a specific campaign, it might make sense to use some of those lower touch options earlier out in the campaign timeline, and then think about using text messaging again for those more kind of urgent day of reminders. Right. And let's talk a little bit about kind of immediate calls to action that people can take. I think in a lot of Annette and I's conversations with customers, people I think typically try to take like a 10,000 foot view of like, how do I build out a total texting strategy? And while I think that's important, I think you don't need to necessarily have that all in place to get started and start playing around with it a little bit, which is going to give you some data about how people respond to that within your specific organization. That'll help you then build a full strategy around it. So just to kind of recap some of the key ways to get started here, you're going to want to connect a phone number to a broadcaster within your nation. You're going to want to confirm your capacity. So do you have enough text messages to reach out to the supporters that you want to reach out to? And then checking in on that textable number in your nation. So how many people in your nation are opted in to receive text messages, have a mobile number, and have a mobile number that is not bad. You'll also want to configure those broadcaster settings, again, to Annette's point, so you're not ending up with new supporters who texted a keyword and then they're just a phone number in your database. You don't have that information you might need to follow up with them, like an email or an address. And then I'd also recommend, again, just focusing in on that engaged group of supporters to start out with. So maybe not starting it out with people that just joined your email list or just signed up with the organization. What are some people we know that were already engaged with us where we can kind of play around with this new medium? And then, of course, setting a date, thinking about those important timelines for your organization. One might make sense for us to consider sending a first text and making sure certainly that you're testing, everybody feels comfortable with it before you jump in. But those are kind of the calls to action that I wanted to share today. With that, I think we want to open things up to questions from folks. So I'm going to take a quick scan at the chat. But certainly if people have burning questions, feel free to unmute and would love to dive into those.
Want to give folks the option to add some new ones, but there were some a little bit earlier, Kylie, that I'm wondering if we might dive into. So particularly around sending out to a list, a contact that you might already had. Taylor asked if the information that folks text in will merge with existing contacts.
Yeah, definitely. So if, for example, you have me as a record in NationBuilder, you have a mobile number for me and I'm just not opted in, if I text in with a keyword, if I already have those pieces of information that you've configured under the broadcaster settings, so name, email, address, it's not going to ask me for that information. It's mainly for new records that you're acquiring. I would say the only situation in which you would potentially have an existing supporter text in and it wouldn't update their profile would be maybe you have a profile for me that has my personal cell phone number and I text in from my work phone number. And in that case, it's not going to recognize that as being associated with an existing profile. And so I would be solicited with those pieces of information. See, I think Elizabeth also had a question about texting. We do typically for, I think for standard customers, there is an add-on that you can purchase for text messaging. I'm not 100% clear on what the commitment for that typically is, but I do think it's fairly flexible. And then for enterprise customers, I know we do typically ask for kind of a 6-month commitment to a particular text volume, just so you're not kind of changing up and down from month to month. But definitely feel free to reach out to our support team to confirm that if you're hoping to just bump up to a significant volume for one particular month, just to make sure we can provide clear guidance on how to best do that. And I think the other thing that we could potentially clarify here is that when we're thinking about that text capacity, so whether that's like 1,000 texts or whatever it is, that includes both text sent and received. So if you are planning out a strategy in which you're using keywords, it's important to keep that in mind. So maybe I'm sending out a blast to 500 supporters. If I'm asking all of them to respond with a keyword, that's probably potentially going to be another 500 texts of incoming text that I'm receiving. All of those will count towards that overall text volume. I do see another question about demographic data. Annette would be curious to hear if you found specific trends. And I'm going to give an annoying answer, which is it depends. So I think certainly I've seen some groups where they're texting an older audience that I wouldn't necessarily stereotypically think of as being more interested in texting. And sometimes people are really receptive to that. I think generally as a trend, what I've seen is that typically it's something that's of interest and expected typically from younger audiences. So thinking of like millennials, Gen Z, if you're working with folks in that community, those are typically kind of some of the trends that I tend to see, but it definitely varies, I think, from group to group. I think there's also some variation too in terms of like what kinds of alerts people want to receive. So there might be maybe a non-traditional demographic that loves receiving those urgent action alerts, but they really do not want to receive fundraising asks via text.
Yeah, I would just echo that, Kylie, and also add that I think it does come back to kind of the opt-in. So depending on how advanced you're planning to text, you can also give folks the option to opt into certain types of messages, and who opts in and chooses to sign up on that list might be surprising. I have also generally found that it is younger demographics, and that's not black and white across the board.
And then Elizabeth saw a question from you about if people text stop to opt out, that would count towards your incoming texts. And then Bonnie, question about kind of cleaning up your email list. That sounds like that's really where the line type and validation service would be helpful, just to kind of assess of all of these maybe 10,000 numbers that we have, or 10,000 records rather that we have in our nation. We have 3,000 that have textable numbers. If you want to validate that those numbers are still active with the carrier, so they've not been shut down or disconnected from service, they're actually mobile numbers, that would be a great service to run through, and you can reach out to our support team about that. And Taylor, I saw a follow-up from you just about existing supporters texting in via keyword. Unfortunately, if you provide kind of the same name, email, address as exists on another record when you're responding to those keyword responses, I don't think it would automatically merge those records. But what will probably happen is those two records will get flagged as being potential duplicates of one another if they have the same first and last name. So that could be another mechanism for kind of automating some of those processes to make sure that you are merging records together when it is just one supporter. And then John, for cost, there is a cost to the line type and validation service. I would say it varies just depending on the audience of numbers that you're looking to analyze. But the cost per record does go down as you increase the volume of records. So I would say it typically makes sense if you're looking to do kind of an annual or biannual cleaning of your list, or maybe it's the first time that you're ever cleaning your cell phone data. But you can reach out to our support team and they can connect you with folks on our sales team that can provide a particular quote based on the specific number of phone numbers that you're looking to analyze. Scanning through questions here to see if anybody else had ones. Oh, there was a question earlier about text preferences that I want to come back to. So some of y'all might have set up in your nation a sign up page where you have different checkboxes that folks can check to opt into particular streams of communication. I think as your texting program evolves, it definitely might make sense to set up a similar page for texting. So a page where you can have people essentially check or uncheck, so append or remove tags from their profile, indicating that they want to receive text alerts about particular things. So I think as you probably like broaden out that texting program, start sending more types of text alerts about different topics, I think it would certainly make sense to think about how you could leverage sign up pages so people can kind of self-identify what they do and don't want to receive in terms of content in those text messages that they're getting from your organization. Let's see, I think there are some other questions that Annette and I have, if there aren't additional ones coming in through the chat. So let me just pick those up. I think one question I often get from folks is the difference between SMS and MMS. So SMS is just kind of a plain text message. Again, you can include an emoji, but MMS is going to be a multimedia message that's not currently supported in the product. So just wanted to clarify those two different types of text messages that you might receive. If anybody has any questions about peer-to-peer texting, happy to dive into that further. I think that's another great option when you're looking to expand the number of opted-in mobile numbers that you have on your list. For example, some customers I work with might have a voter file that they've purchased that has cell phone numbers in it. You can legally text those people through a peer-to-peer platform because there's an individual human person hitting send on those messages, and then ask them in that message to opt in to receive messages from your organization at your number in NationBuilder, at your short code, whatever it may be. So that's one option also for thinking about how I can acquire potentially more mobile and opt-in numbers, especially for people that might be new to your audience. I think digital ads are another medium that I see folks use a lot. So maybe we have some information about our supporter base on Facebook. Not all of those people obviously are on your email list or are opted in to receive text messages. So serving ads to those groups to ask them to submit a form to provide that information might be another good option. And Taylor, I see you're interested in peer-to-peer texting. I do think it's a really powerful tool to use, especially in tandem with, again, some of these other communication channels. I think it could be really helpful for some of those conversations that require more than like a one-word response. I think it's a space that I've seen people be able to have much more of a dialogue with supporters than a lot of these other mass communication channels, especially in a time of COVID. Like I know myself in the 2020 cycle was doing quite a bit of peer-to-peer texting just to provide information to voters about where to show up to the polls, how to get there, what their registration information was. But the integrated providers that I mentioned that will sync data directly back into NationBuilder when people opt in, when they update their information, were Prompt, Call Hub, and Supporter Base. And I can put those names in the chat as well. We can also mention them in the follow-up email just in case there are folks that want to experiment with those two different options. Thanks, Annette. And I've been talking a lot. So Annette, any questions that you often get from supporters that you think would be potentially helpful for us to touch on here?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the most common question I get is like, where do the responses live? But we talked about that. I just want to underline, I think what Kylie mentioned about wanting to create like a very broad and strategic plan for texting and how it fits into everything is wonderful. And like some other initiatives, if y'all are like me, it sometimes just helps to get in there and do it. So if you do set up a keyword, you can have maybe your executive director test it out to see what that experience will be like. And starting with a small group of supporters is a really great way to get started.
Awesome. And then just to underscore, I think peer-to-peer can be really powerful for some conversations, but I also think there's a degree of that you can mimic with the use of keywords and creating kind of that conversational back and forth. So I would say if you're thinking about sending out any kind of text blast where you're looking to solicit more meaningful information for folks, would probably recommend either using a link in that message that is linking to a survey page or a feedback page where people can provide kind of a more extended response than they'd be able to in a text, or using a keyword. So you can have that automated as much as possible. Just because I think, especially when we think about sending to larger audiences of a few hundred, a few thousand, tens of thousands, it's gonna be really difficult to manage those incoming replies. So as much as possible, if you're collecting those on a web form or in the form of keywords, I think that can be really helpful just for lifting some of that load off of your volunteers or your staff. Bonnie, are you referring to the free trial for NationBuilder? I believe text messaging is not included in that free trial period, but it is something you can either typically purchase as an add-on once you convert onto one of our regular plans. All right. I know we are just about at time here, so I want to go ahead and start to close things out a bit. It's been really wonderful connecting with you all. Thanks to everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. We will be sharing a follow-up email over the next few days here that's going to include a link to this recording, a link to the slide deck. We'll include some resources that we talked about today, including links to the pricing page, some of those other integrated providers we mentioned for peer-to-peer, a handful of other pieces there just to make sure you have those resources in hand. But definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our support team or your account manager. And yeah, Annette, any other closing thoughts?
I think you hit it all. Great to have you all here today. Hope to see all your awesome techs out in the world soon.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Have a great rest of your week.